So today we're dealing in the Old Testament still. The title of the lesson this week is Remember This Day in which he came out from Egypt. And of course, we're dealing with Exodus 7 through 13. I have lots that I want to talk about, but I'm not sure where everybody else is with this little list of mine. We're going to talk about hard hearts, miracles, the guiding hand of the Lord, the law of increasing witnesses. Nephi and Moses is an interesting parallel there. Then I've got a bunch of odds and ends at the end, and the Lord delivers. Well, let's do a little bit of a review then. Of course, Moses and Aaron have been before the Pharaoh a couple of 3 times already from last week. And his big push is let my people go. And what's the response been?
No.
Basically, no. But even more than that, if we look at Exodus 8, when the Pharaoh saw that there was respite, every once in a while they would let him off the hook, he would harden his heart and not listen to them and not let the people go. And so I went a little deep dive into this hardening of hearts. And actually, the Hebrew doesn't say hardening, it says heavy. The term is kabod, which means to be heavy in a bad sense, burdensome, severe, dull. It could also mean in a good sense, but in this particular case, it's actually in a bad sense. And as I went into this idea of a heavy heart, I was confused. So I did some research, which you guys know I love to do.
Most people in ancient Egypt were afraid of one particular god, the god Amut, also spelled Ammit. Amut was the god with the crocodile head. The ancient Egyptians believed if you did something really bad during your lifetime, that the god Amut would magically appear and eat you. With her crocodile head, she had the teeth to do so. The god Amut was always on hand after you died in case she was needed. The ancient Egyptians believed that to enter your afterlife, your heart had to be light. You gained a light heart by doing many good deeds during your lifetime. After you died, on your way to your afterlife, you had to travel through the hall of Maat. The god Anubis weighed your heart. The god Thoth recorded the findings, and the god Amut stood by. If your heart was as light as a feather, you passed Ma'at's test and entered your afterlife. But if your heart was heavy, Amut would move swiftly and gobble you up. Wow. Everyone wanted to enter their afterlife, so nearly everyone in ancient Egypt did many good deeds during their lifetime. Nobody wanted to be eaten by the dreaded god Amut, whose body was a mix of lion and hippo, and whose head was that of a crocodile, the 3 most dangerous man-eating animals in ancient Egypt. This sounds like something you teach your young children so that they behave.
This is a good night story. This is your fairy tale before you go to sleep. Yeah, better be good, or the god Amut is going to come.
Santa Claus was keeping a list.
Yeah, no list. It's a one-time deal. It's a full meal deal. It was very interesting. So given that, then this makes more sense in the original Hebrew where his heart was heavy because he was doing bad things. And instead of having a light heart, he had a heavy heart. But that doesn't really translate into English well, so they changed it to the alternate, which is a hardened heart. So at least that began to make a little bit of sense to me.
In the German language, like in English, we say something is hard as in difficult.
Yes.
It's very difficult to do something, so we say it's hard to do. But in German, you actually say it's heavy to do.
So very similar.
Connected to that, but it's similar, yeah.
And that's always a problem with translation. I did a little bit of translation when I was in Italy on my mission because there was an American base nearby. And so the Americans would come and visit. And so you're always translating. And you're right. Sometimes it just doesn't work. You can't do a literal translation. So as much as I give the King James Version a hard time, those translators actually did an awesome job. The whole idea of miracles as a kid was troublesome to me because, Moses would do a miracle and then the magicians would do a miracle. And I always thought, like, how's that even possible? How can they do things like that? They don't have the priesthood. Well, so in my research this week, I found some interesting things. Since the devil lives in a non-mortal existence, he's able to perform signs and miracles. However, being limited to his own sphere and being unsaved himself, he has power to deceive, but not to save or to redeem. Thus the Lord warned us, he that seeketh signs shall see signs, but not unto salvation. And so you'll notice that while the magicians were able to duplicate the original three miracles that Moses and Aaron did: the snake, the leprosy, and the turning the water into blood. As they got on to the next series of 10, they were only able to duplicate the first two. And once they got to the third one, they said, oh, we can't do that one. So your God is God. And we see the hand of God here. And then they were kind of on Moses and Aaron's side after that. And so Satan does have power to do some miracles. I guess we could say miracles. He's able to manipulate things, but his main power is that to deceive. The Savior also declared that Satan had the power to bind bodies of men and women and sorely afflict them. If Satan has power to bind the bodies, he surely must have power to loose them. It should be remembered that Satan has great knowledge and thereby can exercise authority and to some extent control the elements when some greater power does not intervene. And so if it's a contest between God and Satan, obviously Satan is the loser every time. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the guiding hand of the Lord. Some people see this as the Lord being very harsh, hard on the people. How would you characterize the Lord in this respect when you look at the guiding hand that he had in trying to convince Pharaoh? Do you see him as harsh or do you see him as kind?
I saw him as kind.
Yeah, he's really patient in that he's trying to move Pharaoh along incrementally. Quite frankly, if God was just interested in having the people set free, he could have gone to plague number 10. Let's kill off the firstborn and
Well,
get her done.
he could have just zapped the Pharaoh and said,
Well, then there'd be another Pharaoh there too. But I think more than anything else, the whole idea of these miracles that happened was, I think, more for the Israelites. It was a teaching opportunity. They'd spent 400 plus or minus years in an attitude of another country, another culture, another religion. And all of that had to be undone, disassembled. And so let's just talk about that for a moment. I did some research and I've given you here a few of the pantheon of Egyptian gods. Over here on the right-hand side, this is kind of a genealogy chart of the creation of the world. There was the creator God, and it goes down, and then there's air and moisture and earth and sky. And then you get down into these subcategories of gods that you begin to recognize the names, like Isis and Horus and those kinds of names. And then do you remember the analogy that I used before of the globe and how they were understanding their world as a globe, and that there was this chaos and the chaos is separated? Well, the Egyptians had the same belief here. So you can see it here. It doesn't show very well as a globe, but you can see here that Shu, the goddess of the god of air, is separating the earth from the sky. And so this is kind of like the globe right here, and they're all represented by gods. It's a similar view that all of these Near Eastern cultures had. But what do you notice, if anything, about all of their pantheon of gods? Any differences or similarities?
There's the animal heads.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So their view was body parts are interchangeable. So you can have, for example, an animal head on a human body. Then you had human heads on human bodies. And then previously you saw a combination of a 3-in-1, a lion, a hippo, and a crocodile. So they had no problem interchanging parts. So you had something to say, Sue?
They also had female gods.
Yeah, there was no discrepancy there. There had to be male gods and female gods in order to have this genealogical chart, this creation that happened. They understood the necessity of both sex, and so goddesses were very prevalent. In fact, some of them, the really mean ones, were female, which goes to our previous conversation that we had before we went on air, is don't get the mama mad. Okay, now you might notice that they're all, or not all, but most of them are holding some similar objects. Do you notice any objects?
Staff.
There's a staff. Yeah.
And the hook.
There's a hook, a staff.
Ankhs.
Ah, very good. Because you win that, you get to read that one.
The ankh or key of life. In Egyptian belief, life was a force that circulated through the world. Individual living things, including humans, were manifestations of this force and fundamentally tied to it. Life came into existence at the creation of the world, and cyclical events like the rising and setting of the sun were thought of as reenactments of the original events of creation that maintained and renewed life in the cosmos. Sustaining life was thus the central function of the deities who govern these natural cycles. Therefore, the Ankh was frequently depicted being held in God's hand, representing their life-giving power.
And so they really believed in this continuation, this creation, but creation happened on a daily basis. And so that's why you see the Pharaoh going down to the Nile every morning to do his morning routine, where the sun is rising in the water. He's creating life all over again. And incidentally, Pharaoh, as a god on earth, was the only human that had this key of life, because it was necessary for him to start the cycle every morning. And so God said to Moses and Aaron, go get him down there at the river. That's where he's going to be, because he was starting the new day, the new cycle of creation, which then begins to at least make more sense to me. Now, I want to regress here just a little bit back into last week's reading in Exodus 8, verse 16, where the Lord says, stretch forth your rod, and they smite the dust of the land, and it becomes lice. Except it doesn't. It's not lice. It's really a bad translation. This word that we've translated as lice is, for us in the English-speaking world to understand it, really what it was, they were gnats, but they were stinging gnats, is the word that they use in the Hebrew. So this was part of that first phase where the Lord is trying to coax them to let them go, and he's kind of inconveniencing them. There's nothing deadly yet. It's just, well, you know what it's like to have flies all over you or insects. It's just bothersome. But these were stinging gnats that were everywhere, and they stung people, and it was kind of to drive them crazy. But I wanted to take a look, and the reason I went over this is because my next visual aid, this is the comparison of the plagues when you compare it to the gods. And what's happening is that God is taking them down this educational process where he's really unraveling the Egyptian gods. He's demonstrating how he is God, and frogs are frogs, and cows are cows, and gnats are gnats, but I'm God. And so he goes through this whole process, and he basically dismantles the majority of the most powerful Egyptian gods and goddesses. So when he turns the Nile to blood, the real attack here is on these two gods up here, Hapi and Khnum, who were Nile gods. And you can go all the way through. And for example, the frog-headed god was the goddess of birth. And there's the god of the desert. And all of these different gods and goddesses that are represented in Egypt are dismantled because they have no power when it comes to Jehovah. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And there's a lot of debate about this, whether this is really what God's intent was, or was it just to show them that he was God. But my personal feeling is that he was dismantling their whole mythology. He was showing them that, you know, these things that you believe in are not necessarily true.
Well, that makes sense, because he was trying to reorient the children of Israel to the true gospel.
And so he was kind of trying to do a couple of things at once. He was trying to get Pharaoh to let the people go. But I think his major audience was the Israelites. He was teaching them that all this stuff that you've been associating with for the last 400 years is not true. What's true is that I am God, and that I will protect you. You will be my people. I will be your God. And stick with me. Bind yourself to me, not to all of these other things that you've been taught. And that has relevance to us today as well, because it's easy for us. I mean, we don't believe in this mythology, but a lot of us can get easily sucked into the things of the world, into whatever it is that we find appealing in the world today. And the Lord's message through Exodus is he's God, and we should align ourselves with him and let go of these other things that are so easily inviting to us from the world. This was really hard for the Israelites to do, because no sooner did they get out into the desert, like we'll talk about next week, and they want to come home. They want to, at least, at the Nile in Egypt, we had certain things that they're going to miss.
Another thought, Carl, the reason there is this pantheon of gods, was it not, it's kind of like the same role that science plays today in our society. These were an attempt to explain natural phenomena, because that's what people want to do. And they want to explain why things are the way they are, why they work the way they are. And that's what all these sort of gods did for that. So in our context, yeah, it's kind of like, it would be the same as God kind of saying, well, science is nice, but that's not the story. I'm the God. I created the world and I keep it running properly. So look to me. I'm all powerful. And don't look to science for answers to.
You're absolutely right, Rod, because they're using empirical evidence, what they see every day, to explain what's happening around them. Obviously, they didn't have a scientific process that we have today. But in that sense, we use that scientific process today for the very same reason. And what you're saying is exactly right. Our belief in God should superimpose over top of all of these other things that we believe now, which, at some point, even science is overturned all the time, where they say, well, we thought this, but it's not really that, it's this. But the Lord knows, the Lord understands. Okay, so let's just talk about the plagues for a minute.
The fact that the plagues were selective, that is, sent upon the Egyptians but not on the Israelites, adds to the miraculous nature. God often works through natural means to bring about his purposes, but that fact does not lessen the miraculous nature of his work. In the plagues and eventual deliverance of Israel from the bondage of Egypt is a record of remarkable and miraculous intervention by God in behalf of his children. How he actually intervenes is not nearly so significant as that he did intervene.
And so that goes down that same road of miracles. We don't necessarily have to understand how the miracles were done. And there's a great debate. There's been a lot of ink spilled on how these miracles occurred. The most important fact is that God performed them and that he cared enough to save his people. What the plagues tell us regarding the nature of God, we see that throughout this narrative, a loving God who wants to inflict the least amount of punishment possible to get the greatest results. The plagues start small and then they increase in their intensity as the Pharaoh's heart is hardened or becomes more heavy. And this kind of spills over into the Book of Mormon as well, because you'll see that the Book of Mormon uses the Exodus and Moses quite a lot. It's a substantial story in the life of the Israelite people. In the first recording of Laman and Lemuel's opposition to truth, we read that with power being filled with the Spirit, Lehi was able to cause their frames to shake. This was the beginning of God working to reclaim these rebellious men. Later, we see that Laman and Lemuel physically abused Nephi and Sam, and with the appearance of an angel, they cease. Later, the brothers tie up Nephi with cords, seeking to abandon him in the wilderness to die of exposure. After being loosed miraculously by God, their anger increases. It is only through the pleading of the daughters of Ishmael that softened their heart. So you can see there's this gradual change where the Lord has to increasingly show love and kindness to them. The intensity of these messages increases in Nephi's narrative as they are on the sea heading to the Americas. At this point in the story, not even the tears of women would work, nor the words of an aging prophet. Nothing but the power of God, which threatened them with destruction, caused Laman and Lemuel to free Nephi, as the power of the mighty sea forced their hand. And so what we have here is what we call the law of increasing witnesses. So if you remember the story of Alma, he was sent to the city Ammonihah, and he was told to witness to them that they were doing bad things. They were actually perverting the law, perverting the religion, and threatening the government. So Alma went there, and how did they react to Alma?
Throw him out.
Yeah, they said, who's this God that's going to send one witness? So he comes back with the second witness. Then the increase in witness is Amulek, who is one of them. And so now we have a stranger doing it. And then we have Amulek, who's one of them doing it. And what do?
Reject both messages.
They reject him. So then they bring in a convert, the head guy, who's really, fighting against Alma and Amulek, has this miraculous conversion. And now we up the ante again. The Lord is trying to increase the witness. We have Alma, we have Amulek, and then we have one of their own that was fighting them, who's now converted, saying, no, these are good men. They know what they're doing. And they reject him, right? So the next thing we have is they're in prison. And when they're in prison, the walls shake, everything falls down, they come out, and people are running like crazy. The Lord increases the witness yet again. He's giving them a chance each time. And then ultimately what happens, the final witness, the Lamanites come and wipe the whole town out in one day, which they said could never happen. But the Lord increased the witness as was necessary in order to help them. So one of the podcast guys that I was listening to this week said, well, if there was an 11th plague, it would have just wiped out all of the Egyptians. That would have been it. That's where we draw the line. I want to explore some similarities between Nephi and Moses. And Nephi uses Moses and the stories from the Old Testament, at least up to the point where he left, quite frequently. In both the story of Moses in Exodus and Nephi, they go through the sea, and they have an important woman who plays a role in this battle. In Nephi's case, it's his wife, and in Moses' case, it's his sister Miriam. And we're going to talk more about this next week because it kind of bleeds over into Exodus 15. But there are all kinds of similarities, and I was documenting some of this and reading through it. And so we have a killing and a fleeing in both cases. We have an exceeding high mountain, a scattering and a gathering, and speaking with God. So all of these are very similar between Nephi and Moses. And there's quite a lot. An unexpected calling, a visitation of nations. There's leadership issues, power over the elements. Moses parts the Red Sea, Nephi calms the storm, the promised land that they have to go to. So you can see the similarities here are quite striking. A travel through wilderness, the rebellion and the plots of people who are murmuring against them, this reconciliation, and charges that they're trying to usurp authority. It plays the same story over and over again. A divine guidance in the wilderness. For ancient Egypt, this is the cloud and the pillar of light, whereas with Lehi, it's the Liahona. The threat of starvation when they run out of food, how they can be filled with the power of God, the founding of texts, that these texts provide religious and prophetic guidance for centuries and establish a record-keeping tradition, all very similar stories. We have building of sanctuaries, consecrating of priests, we have religious laws that are outlined, the appointment of the successor. And so this typology is very reminiscent of many of the major prophets. Let's talk about Exodus 12, which is the obvious parallel of the Passover with Jesus Christ, the foretelling that's coming. So we have the sacrifice without blemish, a male lamb is killed, the lamb's blood saves Israel. We have none of the bones being broken. As a Christian, we look at this and we can see Jesus Christ very easily. But there are some problems with the Passover when you read them in the Old Testament. Both Exodus 12 and Deuteronomy 16 require that families slaughter and consume an animal at Passover, although they're different. Their depiction differs. In Exodus 12, it stipulates that the offering must be a lamb or a kid. In Deuteronomy, it says it can be a sheep, a goat, or a cattle. All of them are permissible. In Exodus 12, it directs the Israelites to roast the offering and explicitly says don't boil it or don't eat it raw. But then in Deuteronomy, it requires that it be boiled. And so there's some discrepancy in here. It's noteworthy that the Exodus represents the Passover as a family meal, whereas Deuteronomy presents it as a pilgrimage meal held at the temple. So we can see that over time, it evolves, it changes. There's another interesting part that talks about how many people left. Some people say it was like 2 million people. Other people say it was like 20,000 people. And we don't really know what the answer is because the Hebrew word that they use is alep, which can be translated as thousand, or it can be translated as a family or a group, or even just a leader. And so they're not really sure how many Israelites came out of Egypt. We do know that the Egyptians felt like it was enough people that they were being outnumbered, but we don't really know exactly how many people there were. Again, this just shows that we don't have the full story. We don't have a complete picture. And yet there are certain parts of it that are very, very important to us. Now, let's look at Exodus 12, which talks about a mixed multitude went out with them. Does anybody know what this means, a mixed multitude? So let's look at the original scripture. It says the children of Israel journeyed about 600,000. This 1,000 is the one we're talking about. So they had 600,000 men. So how many as an entire group if this is in fact 1,000? But then it says a mixed multitude. But when you go to the Hebrew, it means a blending of many, specifically people. So the group that came out with Moses was not strictly Israelite. So what do we learn from that?
Well, I was thinking there was probably, I'm just guessing, some Egyptian converts. After what they had witnessed, everything that happened, they may have decided to go with them. Some of them. Some of the poorer, lower ones in society or something.
I was just going to say, I imagine that the Egyptians had slaves and servants from other kingdoms and other parts of the world as well. And I'm not sure if this was a sort of a mass evacuation of them as well, too.
Absolutely. We do know now that there were other peoples included, whether they were Egyptians or, as you say, other cultures, we're not sure. But if you just even look at some of the plagues that happened, you can see that at one time, the plague that hit their animals, where the Lord instructed them if they didn't want to lose their animals, that they should bring them indoors. You remember that? And so obviously a bunch of them were listening and believed because they brought their animals indoors. Otherwise, the firstborn of the animals wouldn't have been killed because there wouldn't have been any animals. And so obviously somebody or a great number of people believed in what was going on to the extent that they followed the admonition of the Lord to bring their animals in. In fact, you could even make a case that next week when the 600 chariots go out after them, obviously somebody who owned the horses also brought them inside because otherwise they'd have nobody to man the chariots. And so there were a good number of people who believed, certainly by the 10th miracle, that the Lord was God, that Jehovah was the God, and that he had overturned all of their beliefs. And so there was a mixed multitude, a mixed group of people that went out with them. So that adds some very interesting insights into what we'll talk about next week when some of them are saying, well, maybe we should have stayed in Egypt. Maybe that's not all Israelites talking. That could have been some of the Egyptians in there saying, hey, we had it pretty good. I know he's a powerful God, but we're starving out here.
We also have to remember that Egypt was decimated through this. So, some of them might have just thought, there's nothing left here. Let's go with these
Exactly. We might as well head out with these guys. At least they have miracles. They have a God who takes care of them. And so maybe we'll throw our lot in with them. It's very interesting, and a lot of that is speculation. We just don't know. But certainly it makes sense to a certain point that they would have converts and that they would take those people with them. Anybody who believed that Jehovah was God would have followed them into the desert, especially as Rod has indicated, that their whole country had been pretty much wiped out. I mean, when the hail came, it took out certain part of their crops, but then the grasshoppers came and took out everything else. And so the country was very, very much decimated. The whole idea behind this is that God will watch over us and will, not necessarily according to our timetable, but according to his timetable, will rescue us. And so I would refer you to Helaman 5, in which Helaman is speaking to his sons Lehi and Nephi. And do you remember why he called them Lehi and Nephi?
So they would keep the covenant.
Yeah, so that they would remember where they came from. And Exodus, the book of names, and names are important. Remember, my sons, the words of which King Benjamin spake unto his people. Yea, remember that there is no other way nor means whereby man can be saved, only through the atoning blood of Jesus Christ, who shall come. Yea, remember that he cometh to redeem the world. And that's really what I think the message of this week's reading is, for us to remember that God loves us, that he'll watch over us, that he'll protect us, and that he will save us.